C.S. Lewis once famously proposed a trilemma argument for the divinity of Jesus. He said that Jesus was either a lunatic, a liar, or he actually really was the Son of God. What makes this argument so compelling is that there are a considerable number of people, maybe even a majority of people, who when they encounter the teachings and life and exposition of Jesus, they're willing to say that he's a great moral teacher, but he's not the Son of God. Which is exactly what you can't say about someone who claims to be of divine origin. Jesus claimed to have come down from heaven, and he spoke and acted with an authority that everyone, including him, knew only God had. And when his disciples and his followers confessed that you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God, he affirmed them in that confession. Now, a person like that, if he isn't actually of divine origin, cannot be described as a good moral teacher. A good moral teacher does not lay claim to the most audacious origin story imaginable. He would either have to be a lunatic, a liar, or truly what he claims to be. And based on the kind of person that Jesus was and the things that he said and did, the first two conclusions seem pretty unlikely, which is why it seems that so many people quickly, without even thinking of how incoherent this is, jump to this conclusion that, well, he's still a great moral teacher and guide for us. But then there are people who like to propose a fourth alternative. They say that maybe it was all legend. Maybe his followers crafted a very highly sophisticated conspiracy to convince the masses that all the things that are claimed about Jesus in the New Testament actually happened. What I find interesting about that claim is that there are plenty of case studies from history that we can use to get a glimpse of what that actually would have looked like. So these would be cases in which devotees of powerful, influential, or charismatic leaders tried to manufacture a persona, a story, or an origin story that would compel the general populace to commit the same kind of devotion that they had for this leader. And in those cases, we often find a couple things that are characteristic of these kinds of attempts. The first is that these people are generally very powerful and influential and have a lot of followers and a lot of resources that they can dedicate to the deception. The second is that no matter how sophisticated this conspiracy is, they never do quite hold together perfectly, especially through the passage of time. Falsehoods are a very fragile thing compared to the truth. Take world leaders like the emperors of Rome or other leaders of great states who tried to position themselves in the cosmos next to the gods, but then they eventually died, revealing their mortality, and then they were replaced by people who claimed the same things about themselves, until they all died as well, and eventually their great empires suffered the fate that all temporal things do. Or how about a religious figure like the Prophet Muhammad, who is the founder of Islam, who after spending a time in Mecca as a peaceful religious preacher, he didn't have much success, and so when he migrated to Medina, he quickly gathered a political and militant following, which allowed him to set his sights back on Mecca with military conquest, and that included also the neighboring regions. And this led to him gaining an extensive amount of power and wealth as a warlord. Once he secured this power and wealth, he acted the way that we would expect most powerful men to act. He indulged his carnal appetite, and he took many wives for himself, even more than the Quran actually allows, one of whom was a 9-year-old child bride, which history tells us still played with dolls at the time of their consummation. He personally bought, owned, and sold slaves. He mercilessly killed his political enemies and adversaries, at one point executing hundreds of Jews, numbers as high as 900 they estimate, 900 Jews who had surrendered after a siege in Medina. He once tried to commit suicide, and he was eventually poisoned by a woman whose family he had killed in another siege. Now, maybe that doesn't bother you from a historical perspective. This is the kind of typical thing we hear from great historical figures. But isn't that the point? If he truly was a prophet of God, someone who enjoyed direct revelation and intimacy with God, wouldn't we expect there to be something different about him from all these other historical characters that we are familiar with? And yet, he acted and behaved in exactly the way that we would expect from someone who acquires great wealth and power. Maybe we can get a more contemporary glimpse of this in some of the dictators of the 20th century, people like Joseph Stalin, who was portrayed by the state and his propaganda machine as a man of the people, a compassionate and strong leader. when in fact, he didn't seem to lose any sleep when he deliberately starved to death millions of Ukrainians, and when he purged countless associates, his own personal associates and people that he worked with, out of fear that he thought that they were political rivals or that they lacked loyalty, to the degree where they just started to disappear from photos and history books. This phenomenon of this flimsy facade that everyone could see through was summarized well by Elena Gorokova, who was a writer who summarized it in her memoirs after living under Soviet rule. She said, "The rules are simple. They lie to us. We know they're lying to us. They know we know they're lying to us, but they still lie to us, and we still act like we believe them." The point is, these conspiracies, these lies, fashioned with huge amounts of resources and tons of willing accomplices, still couldn't hold together. Like I said before, lies and falsehood are a fragile thing compared to the truth. So as an explanation about the claims made about Jesus, this is where this becomes a bit of a problem for me. Because the followers of Jesus, the so-called conspirators in this case, they had no wealth, no power, no political authority, no great sophisticated academic training to bring these great minds together to craft this conspiracy. And by their own accounts recorded in the Bible, they were quite clumsy and unintelligent and cowardly, and they were few in numbers. And somehow, with none of these things, no wealth, no power, no political authority, no great intellectual capability, they were able to craft the most convincing conspiracy in history, far surpassing all of these other examples that we've been talking about. And think about what this conspiracy entails. It's one thing to just make up a story, but it's quite another to coordinate your story through hundreds of years of prophecy and religious tradition. Because the Old Testament, which was the precursor to the New Testament and the testimony about Jesus, was a library of books written over hundreds of years by multiple authors and prophets and priests and kings, and it very subtly but convincingly points to Jesus. The Old Testament makes dozens of prophecies about the Messiah, but in a very subtle and somewhat spread out way, such that the experts and the scholars of that day, they weren't even really sure what the Messiah would look like or when he would come or what he would do. But yet somehow the disciples of Jesus were able to connect all of this through their writings of the New Testament. It said things like that Jesus would be, he would be called a Nazarene. He would be born of Bethlehem. He would be born of a virgin. He would teach in a very specific way using parables, and he would heal the sick. They also said that he would be rejected by his own people and even his own followers, and that he would suffer and die. But again, because these things are all spread out and subtle in the Old Testament, it would have taken a brilliant and shrewd and knowledgeable scholar to try to connect and weave all of these things together so that they pointed to Jesus, and so that their crafting of this false narrative would have to be just ironclad. You know, I think about like authors who write fictional stories and how they have to get lots of people going through the text to make sure that there's consistency between their characters and the stories and they don't accidentally contradict themselves. That's not easy to do. So are we to believe that Jesus' disciples, who were composed primarily of unsuccessful fishermen and tradespeople, were able to weave this very complex narrative, drawing from history and prophecy and religion and theology and philosophy? That seems like an absurd explanation on the face of it. Next, they had to somehow make Jesus' body disappear in order to claim that he was resurrected from the dead. Of course, if they made this claim and someone could produce the body, well, there goes your conspiracy. And they had to somehow do this under the careful surveillance of Roman guards, the Roman governorship, and the Sanhedrin, who were anticipating that they would do this very thing. Then they had to convince their temporaries and all the people who had great expectations for Jesus based on the miracles that they had witnessed and the things that he was teaching, but then saw him die and were like, oh, I guess he's not who we thought he was. They had to convince all those people that Jesus actually came back from the dead and truly was the Son of God. And somehow they had great success in recruiting these people. Now let's just indulge the conspiracy theory for a second here. Let's imagine that Jesus never even existed, or if he did, he wasn't that well known, or that none of the things about him are really true. Put yourself in their shoes. So you In the place and time where you live, you have to go out and convince people that a great and public teacher who was publicly executed is now back from the dead and ascended into heaven, and that hundreds of people have witnessed this, and that you could go and ask any of these people yourself. If the person you're talking about had never existed, don't you think your contemporaries, the people living in that place and time, would be like, I think we would have remembered a great public moral teacher that everybody was familiar with who was publicly executed, but we don't know who you're talking about. That is not the kind of thing that would win a lot of sympathy. It's a lie that is easy to poke holes in, especially for people that live in that place and time. But new followers they were gaining by the thousands, which I don't think would have happened if it would have been as easy as pointing out that this Jesus guy you're talking about, who's supposedly back from the dead now, who you claim was publicly with great fanfare executed in front of all of us, we've never even heard of him until now. So clearly Jesus existed, and clearly people were familiar with him. So the next thing you'd want to do is scrutinize this claim. They claim that there are hundreds of witnesses of this resurrection, of Jesus coming back from the dead. Well, that should be something that's fairly easy to scrutinize it. And so they did. And it held up to that scrutiny. They weren't able to discredit it based on that ground. Lastly, since nothing else was working to suppress this movement, they threatened them with imprisonment, torture, and even death if they didn't recant their story. Again, put yourself in the shoes of the conspirators here. Would you suffer torture and death for a lie that you fabricated with really ambiguous motives? You haven't gained anything from it. You haven't won any power, wealth, or honor, or child brides, if that's what you're into. All you've gained is trouble with the authorities. And these are the same people who publicly admitted in their own testimonies that when Jesus was arrested and tortured and executed, they all ran away for fear that they couldn't even watch it. And now suddenly these are the people who are standing up to that same threat. What could possibly compel them to behave this way? In defense of a lie? Really, you think that they would suffer torture and death for a lie, along with hundreds of other co-conspirators that they had embroiled in this thing? Because that's what they did. They all met a gruesome fate. St. Peter was crucified upside down because he was unwilling to die the same way that Jesus did. St. Bartholomew was skinned alive. St. Stephen was stoned to death. And St. Paul was beheaded. And the list goes on and on. So among the rival explanations for who Jesus was and what he did, we have he was a lunatic, a liar, a legend, or the Son of God. The first two are fairly unlikely, as we've already discussed. The third one is based on this idea that his followers crafted this very sophisticated conspiracy, this fabrication, even though they had nothing to gain by it and everything to lose, and they did lose everything by it. And why would they do that? It's so unprecedented that I think it deserves to be dismissed as quickly as it's conceived. Lastly, in closing, I want to address a common rebuttal that comes to us regarding this question of the apostles and why they would die for these convictions. Because people will point out that lots of people will go to their death for political or religious beliefs. That doesn't make those beliefs true. And that's true. But we're not talking about a religious belief or a faith-based belief in this case. We're talking about an eyewitness testimony. That's what the followers of Jesus were doing. They weren't making claim to something that they hadn't themselves observed. They were claiming to have been eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus themselves and all together. Imagine if you have a court case in which dozens of eyewitnesses come forward and they say that they would die for the honor of their testimony. That's how convinced of it that they all are. I think most reasonable people would look at that and say, well, yeah, these are credible witnesses. That's a far different thing from people who are willing to die for something that they don't actually know about. They just believe in it. And that's the difference between the followers of Jesus who died for their faith and people who die for other causes. Then he probably was the Son of God. And why is that so hard for us to believe? Just because it's a supernatural claim? Most people already believe in God. That's already a supernatural claim. So it shouldn't be so hard for us to believe that God, in order to reveal himself to us and to close the gap between him and us, would send his Son. If he was all powerful, if he really was God, he could do that. And if God is love, the way most people love to recite, it makes sense that he would do that. I think it's important for us to be a little more consistent about this and to stop being so embarrassed by supernatural claims, especially when so many people believe in ghosts, or so many people believe in horoscopes or fate, Or so many people believe that you can send good energy and good vibes like telepathically through the airwaves or something. If that's all socially acceptable, then so too should be the very rational conclusion that Jesus was a great moral teacher who was also of divine origin. Hey, thanks for watching that. If you enjoyed it, then be sure to like and subscribe for more. And if you want to support the making of content like this, then please consider joining my online community, The Reinforcements. It's kind of like Patreon, but instead of being beholden to a big tech company, it's a website I built entirely myself, so there's no risk of us being censored or shut down or anything like that. There are hundreds of people who have already signed up, and our mission is to renew and reinforce the church. So if that's you, then come check it out. As an added bonus for certain tiers, I will also send you a gift box from Glory and Shine, which is a Catholic, family-owned and operated company. They make bath and body products. They're actually their beard balm I'm supporting, or I'm sporting right now. I'm not just a spokesperson, I'm actually a customer. So even if you don't join the Reinforcements, maybe check them out anyways. Glory and Shine, they're an amazing company.